I think all of us could claim feasibly that at some point in our lives we've been on an adventure. It's such a vague term, so of course we can. To one person, an adventure might be classified as skiing unsupported to the South Pole, but to someone else it might simply be buying a different flavour of breakfast cereal. So it's such an overused term, but I still really like it. I like the simplicity of it. And I think the essence of it to me, if you distill it right down, is that it's a choice. We can choose to do something different, something exciting, something new, and something challenging. And I make a living, more or less, from adventure. I try to go to parts of the world that I think will be interesting, and then bring back stories from there. And through writing and through making films, that's how I create a living. And the closest thing I have really to a job description is being an adventurer. And I know that doesn't really sound like a job. I think many of my friends would disagree that that's a real thing. Most of them maintain that I'm just saying it wrong and it's actually pronounced unemployed. But despite that, that's what I want to focus on today. And I want to talk specifically about the idea of going on a journey. The simple act of going from point A to point B, but with the crucial absence of predictability in the middle. And that void, that gap, that's the space for adventure. And I think that unknown area is where the most wonderful development and learning can happen. I began going on these adventures when I finished university. On the day I graduated, I was offered a job, and it was quite a good job. And that was quite a surprise to me. I'd spent 3 years doing film studies, so I wasn't expecting to ever get a job doing anything. But I took the job because it seemed sensible to do so, and I realized within a week that actually that was the wrong decision. There was nothing about this job that was exciting or fulfilling for me, and I began to worry that I could get stuck in this comfortable life, and 20, 30, 40 years down the line, I would find myself still doing something that I really didn't care about. What I really needed was something that would challenge me, something to shake me up. What I needed was an adventure. And so I came to a compromise. I would work for a year, save as much money as I could to fund this adventure, and then I would quit and set off. And that's what I did. Over the course of a year, I saved about £3,000. Then I sold everything I had, bought a bicycle and a one-way plane ticket to New York, and set off on my adventure. And I could have gone anywhere and done anything, but I decided to go by bicycle because it's such a wonderfully cheap and easy way to travel. You have so much freedom. And I thought I would start in the USA because it felt foreign yet familiar and a way to ease myself into the journey. And when I began, the first thing that became apparent was that I was a total idiot, really. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I had packed this bicycle, hugely overpacked. There's a great debate in cycle touring circles as to whether you carry all of your gear on the side of your bike or whether you carry it in a trailer and then drag it along behind you. But I didn't realize that this was an either-or option, so I took both. I was overpacked and underprepared, and I didn't know where I was going. I was unfit. I spent most of those first few days being either miserably cold or lost or scared or a combination of all three. And my only solace was that each night I could get into my tent. This was the last remnant of the security from the life I'd left behind. But even then, it seemed like pretty feeble protection from the elements. And I'd done a lot of camping before, but suddenly on my own in the forests of New York State, I was terrified of everything, every sound outside the tent. I was convinced it was killers coming to kill me, or bears coming to eat me, or killer bears, or any of the sorts of things you begin to create in your imagination. And I kept waiting for this romanticized, ideal version of the journey in my head to begin, without actually clocking that, of course, the journey that I needed was the one that I was already on. It wasn't necessarily particularly fun at the time, but this is one of the wonderful things about travel and about these types of journeys. It's just how formative they are. And I learned so much in those first few weeks of bicycle travel, probably much more than any other point in my life to that date. I eventually got much better at the lifestyle. Over the course of the next few months, I cycled all the way across the USA through some fabulous landscapes. I reached the West Coast, and from Canada, I came down to Mexico. And over the next 14 months, I tried just to take on any adventures that came my way, any opportunities. I had no real plan of where I was going to go. I eventually ended up in New Zealand via a free plane ticket that was bestowed upon me, and then on to Australia and up through the islands to Southeast Asia, to Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and China. All these countries and cultures that I really knew nothing about until I was there having this adventure on my bicycle. And I learned so much about the world, but I also learned so much about myself. And finally, after 14,000 miles of pedaling, my journey came to a conclusion in Hong Kong for the very simple reason that I ran out of money. And that felt like the perfect way to end this trip. I'd saved just enough so that I could fly home from wherever I finished. And while I waited for my flight, I had a few days to think everything through. And I came to two conclusions, really. The first one was that I'd been very fortunate to be able to have this adventure, to find the time and the money to go off and do it. And it was quite selfish in that respect. But because I'd learned so much about myself and had a greater sense of my strengths and feelings, that really felt worthwhile. The second realization I had was that I'd got quite tired of traveling just for the sake of traveling. It had been great to begin with, but now I wanted something a bit more worthwhile to do with my time, and this is where I hit upon the idea of storytelling. I began to see that when done well, storytelling can be a way to give a platform to thoughts and ideas that wouldn't otherwise get heard. And I found for the first time in my life I had some passion, some direction, something I wanted to put my time and energies into. So when in Hong Kong I met a British-born adventurer who was planning a new expedition and he invited me along, I immediately signed up. Rob's idea was to walk the length of China, to start in the very north and walk back down to Hong Kong, to really see how a country changes and develops at that speed, at the slow speed of moving on foot. And the plan was pretty simple. We'd start on the northern edge of the Gobi Desert and head south for 3,000 miles. We roughly figured that we would try and walk a marathon a day, 25 to 30 miles a day, 6 days a week, and we should be able to do the trip in about 6 months. We told everyone we could about the idea. We wanted to go to China because we felt like the rest of the world was really starting to look towards China and wanting to know more about this country that was starting to dominate world affairs. And because our idea was reasonably unique, no one else was doing something like this, and because it was relevant, we attracted quite a lot of interest. And eventually, after many meetings, we got a commission from National Geographic to make a 4-part TV series about the journey. So in November of the same year that I'd finished cycling in the spring, we set off out of a small, dusty frontier town in the Gobi Desert. And it was very strange to leave behind this little town and head south on this tarmac road, which eventually faded into a dusty trail, and then that too disappeared. And within about a day and a half, we were in a position where we could turn around 360 degrees and see absolutely nothing that was man-made. Quite a scary place to be, but also quite a privilege. It was already minus 20 in the Gobi because it was deep into winter. And as we got used to the lifestyle, we began to get a little bit better at the walking that we had to do every day, a little bit fitter, a little bit stronger. And one of our jokes that we shared, albeit a bad one, was that at least we wouldn't have to deal with snow. No matter what else the Gobi Desert threw at us, we wouldn't have to deal with snow. One morning we woke up to find that joke wasn't quite so funny anymore. These awful blizzards came in and we had total whiteouts. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and for days we walked through this landscape wondering why on earth we were there, wondering when this seemed like a good life choice. And what I find is that often when I'm in these scenarios where I'm so far out of my comfort zone and everything seems slightly miserable, it's so new to me, so unknown, and while it can be awful at times, it also promises a great reward because it's so unpredictable. And this was a perfect example. After a couple of days of walking through this blizzard, we saw some smoke on the horizon and arrived at this Mongolian ger, where the nomadic family rushed out to meet us and said, come in, you silly English people, and we'll look after you. And they brought us into their ger and gave us some warm camel's milk and let us spend the night on their floor. And another reason I love going on these journeys is because of the perspective that it grants. I'm constantly reminded of the inherent goodness of humanity. 99.9% of the people I've met on my trips have always been good and kind. And if you ever feel like you're losing faith in the human race, then I recommend that you go out for a journey on foot or by bicycle, and quite quickly you'll be reminded of just how good most of us are. For the next 6 months, we headed south and we watched as a country changed. We saw the landscape change from desert to mountains to plains. We saw as the climate and weather changed from subarctic Gobi Desert to subtropical lush green vegetation in the south. And we really saw a country that was changing from old to new, old being knocked down to make way for progress. And millions of people moving from rural areas to the new urban settlements. China's really a country that's in flux at the minute. And we had to learn quite quickly to be very patient. Walking is so slow, and to begin with, the slowness of our march felt very monotonous, and we wanted to just move a little bit quicker, but we had to learn to embrace that and to enjoy that very slowness, and to be able to appreciate that it gave us time to spend with people along our route. And of course, that eventually became one of the greatest parts of the journey, having that time to spend with the people that lived in China. After 195 days of walking, we arrived at the South China Sea and finished our journey where the road literally ended by the ocean. When I came back from this trip, I found it was such an overwhelming experience that I struggled woefully with real life. I was so incompetent at all the things required for regular life, and I immediately began to plan a new journey. With another friend, we cooked up a plan to go to the Arabian Desert to cross the Empty Quarter, the largest sand desert in the world, following in the footsteps of one of Britain's greatest explorers, Sir Wilfrid Thesiger. And Thesiger had lived in the Empty Quarter for about 5 years in the 1940s, crisscrossing with the local tribes. And one of his greatest journeys was from Salalah on the south coast of Oman up to Dubai, which he wrote about in his book, Arabian Sands. And we were going to try and retrace that journey, but to update it. Where Thesiger traveled with camels, the sensible method for crossing the desert, we didn't really know how to use camels. We didn't know how to drive them. We couldn't afford them. So instead, we developed our own method for crossing the desert. The best idea we could come up with was to build a large metal cart, load it with 6 weeks worth of food and water, and then drag it behind us across the sands. And that was really about as stupid as it sounds. We got a friend to build this. We got a prototype, and we took it out to test it in the nearest desert. Well, not really a desert, more of a, I suppose you would probably call it more of a beach. Margate Beach in Kent, in the rain, in October by the amusements. And we pulled it up and down for about 20 minutes, and it didn't really work, but we'd run out of time, so we went to the desert anyway. And I really can't impress upon you just how poorly suited this cart was for the purpose that we needed it. It really didn't work in the sand at all. And it sounds quite a desperate situation, and it was, but I find on these sorts of journeys, you're faced with a quite simple choice. You either give up and go home, and you're ridiculed by your friends for the rest of your life, or you just figure it out. And we recall that in Salalah, before we left, we'd met an expat Italian called Claudio, who just happened to be a mechanical engineer. So we called him up and asked him if he might have any ideas as to how to fix our desert cart. And he dashed out to the desert with his pickup, saying, "I've got loads of ideas to help you fix your cart." And over the next couple of days, he began to saw it into bits. He built a steering column. He helped us spread the weight a little bit better, and eventually sent us back out into the Empty Quarter Desert with a perfectly suited vehicle for crossing the sands. We found eventually the journey we were looking for. We found the heat and the hunger and the thirst that Thesiger wrote about, but also the wilderness and the solitude, the wonders of traveling through the desert. Our life became very simple. We had no communications, no mobile phones. We would wake at about 4 o'clock every day, be walking by 5 until the sun rose, and then keep walking until the heat of the day got too much. In the middle of the day, we would hide under the cart for shelter and shade, and then we would walk again until the sun set. A very disciplined and ascetic lifestyle. We found, of course, as well, that the desert had changed dramatically since the time Thesiger was there, mostly due to the discovery of oil in the region. And now the desert is crisscrossed with little tracks and roads, and we met a lot more people than Thesiger did during his time there. And this became wonderful as well. It became a real social experience, spending time with these people who inhabit the desert. Before finally, after 6 weeks of walking and about 1,000 miles, we arrived into the madness of Dubai, at the end of it, the complete antithesis to everything that Thesiger enjoyed about the desert lifestyle. I came back from this trip and based myself in London, and this is now where I live, and I quite like having a base. I'm getting better at the real life stuff in between trips, but I still like to go off on these journeys whenever I can because there's so much to learn from them. And my most recent trip took me back to the Middle East, this time though to Iran. I wanted to go to Iran and see what the country was really like, away from the largely negative media headlines that we get here in the West. And together with a friend, we went to the headwaters of the Karun River, the longest river in the country, with the idea being that we would follow it from source to sea and use that as an excuse to explore the country. When we arrived at the headwaters, it looked like this. This might not be the standard image you have in your head of Iran, but at 3,500 meters in the mountains, this is what it looks like. We walked down it to begin with on foot, carrying these packs, and really watched until tributaries and snowmelt helped with the volume of the river and changed it beyond all recognition. It grew and grew and grew and passed through some wonderful ancient cities until finally it was big enough that we could inflate the small rubber boats in our backpack and begin to paddle downstream, which was a great way to see the river from water level and get a whole new perspective on it. All that went very well until I capsized in some rapids and lost my paddle in a whirlpool, and instead then we had to get out, hike out of the gorge and think of a new method to travel the river. In the nearest city, we asked around as to whether anyone might have any bicycles that we could borrow, and that might seem quite a tall order in a country you don't really know, but in Iran anything's possible. People are wonderfully open to these type of things, and we were sent immediately not to the local bicycle shop, but instead to the local clock shop, where the owner happened to be an aficionado of Cannondale bikes, and he absolutely insisted that we borrow 2 of his finest touring specimens. His friend arrived and said that he would lend us all the rest of our gear, and we were sent packing on our trip, the only catch being that we had to promise to have lots of fun and take lots of pictures. And for the next few weeks, we followed the rest of the river, having this wonderful, social, safe experience in Iran until we reached the Persian Gulf. These are the biggest journeys I've gone on, and all of these journeys in some way have been a catalyst that has changed the course of my life entirely. I learn so much from them every single time I go, from the early days when I was developing a lot of self-confidence and a sense of responsibility, to the specifics that I take from each and every trip, things like patience in China, discipline in the empty quarter, flexibility in Iran. And most of all, I think what I enjoy from them is the ability to disconnect. We live in an increasingly busy and cluttered world, and we're always contactable, and we're governed by our lines of communication, and we're losing that empty time that we have had in previous years to process and to think and to be creative. And I strongly feel we need to reclaim that, and going on these journeys is a brilliant way to disconnect from all of that sort of stuff. And so this is my suggestion, this is my point. I would like to encourage you to take a journey of your own, and it doesn't need to be as long as some of mine. It doesn't need to be as miserable or as silly as some of the trips that I've done. Do a journey that in some way fits with you. If traveling by foot doesn't excite you, then perhaps try traveling by bicycle. If the human-powered thing doesn't really float your boat at all, then maybe go by train, go by motorbike. Go for a day, go for a week, go for a year, go for whatever suits you, but do go. And I think you'll find that it's a very rewarding process. What I've told you about today has been intensely personal, but the concept is relevant to everyone. And it might seem quite a self-indulgent thing to do, but I really believe that by giving ourselves this time to process and analyze ourselves, we put ourselves in a much better position to be efficient, effective versions of who we are, and then to use our skills and abilities to inspire positive change around us. And I think the catalyst for all of that can just be going on a journey. So I encourage you, go out, try it, and I think you'll find it's extremely rewarding. Thank you.